We've got a brined pork chop with a crisp outer edge sitting on top of a simple egg fried rice. This is my version of Din Tai Fung's famous pork chop fried rice. The first thing you want to do, and we'll get to the rice later, but is concentrate on the pork chop. And I've got two good size, sort of thick pork chops here, which I'm going to actually bash out, thin out, and tenderize. We'll tenderize it with the cleaver, but also using the brining solution. The first thing with your tenderizing is I've got a sort of just over thumb size, and I've got a small thumb, so just over thumb size. It's about 1.5 of my thumb thickness of pork chop. I quite like to get rid of the fat. We want to go as close to the restaurant style as possible, and then use the back of your knife to just bash it out. What we're doing here is not just tenderizing, but sort of opening up the surface area of the pork chop so that as much of the marinade can get into as possible. Once you've bashed with the end of your knife, or the back of your knife, then I just sort of flatten it out with the flat side of my blade. I don't want the pork chops to go too thin, and actually when they're sitting and brining for say 20 minutes or so, they will sort of become a little bit more plump again. So that there is ready. Very, very simple and quite classic or traditional Chinese restaurant style brining solution. I've got about a tablespoon of salt here and a bowl full of water, and then 1.5 teaspoons of bicarbonate of soda. And the bicarbonate of soda will help to tenderize that meat quite quickly. You don't want to leave your pork in this mix for too long, because you don't want it to get too salty or too spongy. We're just trying to soften that meat. So once that's all dissolved into there, you can pop your pork into that brining liquid. No more than 20 minutes. Now we may as well get on with preparing the ingredients for the rice whilst that pork is brining. The rice part is really simple, except Din Tai Fung, I know they use a special grain of rice, and I guess the closest you'll get is either if you can find a Taiwanese grain or a Japanese or style sushi rice or Japanese white rice, which is slightly more plump and thicker in grain. You want to cook it and steam it like you would any other. You could use a rice cooker if you have one, or on the hob. Beat your eggs, and then I've got a couple of spring onions, finely chopped. Right, my chops have had plenty of time to brine, so I'm going to take them straight out, and you'll feel that it's almost sort of got a different texture to the outside because of that sort of 20 minutes in that salt and bicarb solution. I don't want to pat those dry. You want to keep it a bit wet, because what we're going for is a slight sort of creamy marinade around this meat. So when I fry it, it has a crisp edge, but doesn't feel too battered. Now, seasoning, or the marinade for my pork chops. I'm gonna go for about a teaspoon of 5-spice, half a teaspoon of sugar, because it's got this slight sweetness to some Shaoxing rice wine, about 1 to 2 tablespoons, light soy sauce, and about a teaspoon of sesame oil. I'd recommend massaging that through before you add your corn flour. Get all that flavor into the meat, nothing sitting into the bowl. Massage it well. Once all that meat and the rivets from that bashing has picked up the sauce, then get a couple of tablespoons of corn flour in and do the same again. As I say, what I want is a sort of creamy texture around the edge of both the chops. And that will give you that sort of crisping outside of the pork itself when we deep fry it. Now you'll notice it on the induction today, our gas is conked out, but I'm just checking the heat on this oil and that is sizzling straight away. So So you're just gonna carefully lay the meat piece by piece into that wok. And it doesn't take long at all to fry this because they're quite thin pieces of pork. You do need that high heat on the oil to get that instant sort of crisping around the edge. Whilst you're deep frying, you'll smell the sort of sweet aroma of the 5 spices sort of straight off that marinade. If you don't want your pork to curl up as much as mine has, you can also just sort of slit or score the meat before you marinate it. And that pork is done. We'll just let that rest before I chop into it. And meanwhile, I'm gonna fry my rice. Well, it's a great time to show you guys our new woks. And these are pre-seasoned carbon steel woks. So it looks like a non-stick wok, but it actually has been fired a few times in the factory. So you have to look after it much like a classic, more traditional carbon steel wok, but you don't have the faff of having to season it yourself. I've got my rice that is nicely cooked here, and I've just sort of run my spoon through it. It's actually still warm, which you'd think is counterintuitive to most recipes for a fried rice, but it will work nicely if you've got the water to rice quantity right. It'll still separate out well. My egg, my beating egg, as soon as it's smoking hot, that can go in. Give that a swirl around whilst that's cooking. And then when it's sort of half cooked, then I'd say get your rice in, because I want my rice to pick up a little bit of that sort of raw egg so that each grain comes out a little bit more yellow in colour. Start pushing into it. You can see how nicely those plump grains of rice are separating out, and at the same time there's no sticking at the bottom of my wok. And whilst we're going, a pinch of salt, white pepper, a couple of flicks through, lovely colour on that, drizzle of sesame oil and a sprinkling of spring onion at the end, a couple of flicks through, and then you shouldn't have much on the bottom of your wok at all. Now my pork chop, just gonna sort of make use of that curl. Sorry, Din Tai Fung, for my imperfections. But you know what? That'll naturally sit over the rice quite nicely. Dome of rice. And then your pork chop with that delicate crisp over the top. My version of Din Tai Fung's famous pork chop fried rice. Let's take a moment to talk about this pork. The slight crisp around the edge of it just works. Not too crispy, just sort of coating the pork with all that flavour from the marinade. Love it. Love the simplicity of it. If you like this dish and you feel like there's a restaurant dish that you've tried before that you just really want to learn how to cook, let us know what that is in the comments below. See you next time.